Join us during Native American Heritage Month as we honor Indigenous voices and stories and explore the rich history, culture, and contributions of Native American communities. Enjoy our programs and check out our curated book lists for adults, teens, and kids. Learn more at queenslibrary.org. Let everyone know that you support the freedom to read. Get your Freedom to Read Special Edition library card today at your nearest QPL location while supplies last. Visit our website to learn more. Each week in November, young readers in 2nd, 3rd, and 4th grades can embark on a QPL reading challenge inspired by the popular Dog Man book series. The more books they read, the more rewards, prizes, and paw badge stickers your kids will earn. Join us and read like a hero all month long. Visit queenslib.org/blog to learn more. Let's get ready for Thanksgiving. Join us at the library for holiday festivities and crafts throughout the month of November. Visit the QPL calendar on our website to learn about all of our Thanksgiving programs.
Good evening and welcome to Culture Connection. Culture Connection, curated by Dan Zaleski and assisted by Liz Keogan, and now in its 12th year at the Queens Public Library, is proud to present international artists from emerging talent to award-winning masters. These disciplines include music, theater, author talks, and film. Now expanding into a virtual format, Culture Connection is currently reaching a global audience. My name is Dave Shoemaker. I'm a professor in the Sage School of Philosophy at Cornell University, and I'll be your host for the next hour. Today, I'm very pleased and honored to be in the company of Columbia University colleagues, Alexander Stilla and Jelani Cobb. Our aim is to have a freewheeling conversation with each other and you on issues raised by Cobb's new collection of essays drawn from the New Yorker, Three or More is a Riot, How We Got Here, essays from 2012 to today. So let me introduce our participants here. First, Alexander Stilla is the Sao Paulo Professor of International Journalism in Columbia's Journalism School. He's worked as a contributor to the New York Times, La Repubblica, the New Yorker magazine, the New York Review of Books, the New York Times magazine, All Things New York, the Atlantic Monthly, and many others. He's the author of Benevolence and Betrayal, 5 Italian Jewish Families Under Fascism, several other books, and his latest book is called The Sullivanians, Sex, Psychotherapy, and the Wildlife of an American Commune, which I clearly need to read. Jelani Cobb joined the Columbia Journalism School faculty in 2016 and became dean in 2022. He's been a staff writer at The New Yorker since 2015. He received a Peabody Award for his 2020 PBS Frontline film, Whose Vote Counts, and was a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize in Commentary in 2018. He's also been a political analyst for MSNBC since 2019. He too is the author of many books, including The Substance of Hope, Barack Obama and the Paradox of Progress, and To the Break of Dawn, a freestyle on the hip hop aesthetic. He's the editor or co-editor of several volumes, including The Matter of Black Lives and the Essential Kerner Commission report. His many incredible fellowships, fantastic fellowships from around the world. He currently serves on the board of directors of the American Journalism Project and the board of trustees of the New York Public Library. He was elected to the American Academy of Arts and Sciences in 2023. Welcome to you both.
Thank you.
Thank you for being here. As I said, my aim is to facilitate a conversation on some of the topics in Jelani Cobb's new book. But before we launch into topics that are raised specifically by the book, Jelani, I was curious to hear some of your thoughts on what has been a rather unique, perhaps historic day in New York politics. You're basically a New Yorker through and through. And I'm wondering what you might think about the man who was just elected in rather overwhelming fashion as the new mayor of New York City, Zohran Mamdani.
Well, I mean, I think it's fascinating. There's on one level, I try to look at these things from, the entire vantage point, and, I would welcome, my colleague Sandro Stilla's view on this as well. On one level, the most mundane thing in New York City politics happened last night, which is that the Democratic nominee won the general election. Not something that anyone in New York is shocked about if that happens. And the machinery of New York lends itself to that kind of result, and with obviously some notable exceptions. But on the other side of it is just who that nominee was, and the route that he took, the unlikely route that he took, to that position. In addition to the competition that was mounted from, the former governor, for a good while, the sitting mayor, and so on. And, I think that, I tend to not want to go to the obvious kind of symbolism of it, but it is significant that we have the first Muslim mayor of New York City. That, he's 34 years old and has just barely turned 34. He is a democratic socialist, which is wildly atypical for New York, not unprecedented, obviously, but wildly atypical for New York City politics. And at the same time, the thing that is really interesting to me is that for the past decade now, as we've seen a great surge of right-wing populism in American national politics, I've said that there has been and there's a long historical tradition of that, in the United States, but there's also a very long tradition of progressive populism that, with the exception of, Bernie Sanders, challenges in the Democratic primaries, you haven't really seen that register in the way that it might, particularly given the circumstances that we're thinking about socially and economically and so on. And it's an interesting question as to whether or not, maybe not people who would specifically avow democratic socialists, but maybe this heralds the beginning of a kind of left-wing populism that will be responding in many ways to the same thing that the right-wing populism is, but with a different set of prescriptions.
Alexander, did you want to add something?
No, I think Jelani, kind of nailed it. The elements of novelty, electing the first Muslim mayor of New York seems very significant. And, obviously not just the New York election, but the other ones in New Jersey and Virginia indicate, that there's a public out there that's reacting, and not positively, to what we've seen in the last, 10 or 11 months. There'll be a really interesting, tension within the Democratic Party between the sort of Spanberger moderates and, the Mamdani progressives. But hopefully they can figure out a way to get along if the Democratic Party wants to be serious about, winning in 2026.
Mm-hmm.
So I instead wanted to ask Jelani about the title of his book, because when I first picked it up, I thought, Three's a Riot. I wonder what that refers to. And then, of course, the answer to that came fairly soon on page 3 of the introduction. And I wonder if you could just maybe read that paragraph, which is the second paragraph on what is page X1X in the introduction.
Okay.
Begins the title, because I think it's very indicative.
Yeah, I have it.
Okay, because I think it's very indicative. Well, you read it first, and then I'll tell you why I think it's indicative.
So I'll just read that paragraph in itself.
Yeah.
The title, Three or More is a Riot, is a reference to the frequent criminal code definition holding that a riot is the concerted, unlawful action of 3 or more people. When I came across that definition in the course of covering these stories, It recalled the South Carolina Code that, in the aftermath of the Great Stono Slave Rebellion of 1739, defined a slave revolt as the presence of more than two Negroes, as we were then called, without the company of a white man. The earliest pieces in this collection were published during the Obama presidency, and at the moment when the contours of the backlash to his mere existence were just becoming visible. These resurgent, open tides of white nationalism and belligerence culminated in the election of Donald Trump as president of the United States in 2016, a harrowing development that imperiled not only the fragile and partial progress achieved by the civil rights movement of the 1950s and 60s, but American democracy itself. The more recent pieces, filed in an election year that already saw the reemergence of the themes of race and rage and enfeebled democracy that had been so prominent in the previous two races. In curating this collection, I've pulled together pieces that shed light on the places, events, and personalities that are important to understanding how we navigated a besieged decade.
Mhm.
And that's that paragraph.
So one of the reasons why I picked it out, other than the fact that I thought it was useful for potential readers to understand the title, but also I think it reflects, Jelani was an historian before he was a journalist or contemporaneous more with being a journalist, and that historian's foundation is, I think, felt very much even in the journalistic pieces, and that being able to dip back into deep history, to go back to the 18th century to actually illuminate things happening in the 21st century is, I think, one of the strengths of the book, and you see that at many points. So I wonder how you think about that as you you do journalistic work, but you're also drawing on this previous experience, how that ends up informing your work.
The thing that historians are fanatical about, is context. And if you give them any problem, any social question, they instinctively want to look at the dynamics that preceded it and the dynamics that preceded those and the various threads that contributed to the eventual outcome or the eventual moment that we're trying to understand. And always, you said I'm a native New Yorker. You can tell by the sirens outside. You're probably picking that up. But the thing that really I found to be just kind of fertile was using that contextual approach to journalism, because we're mired in contemporary events. We're anchored rather in contemporary events, but there's often a kind of bigger contextual, set of questions that we don't usually get time to grapple with.
Mm-hmm.
And so the part of me that is interested in journalism always wants to look backward, into the history. And the part of me that's interested in history always wants to look forward to see, what the ultimate implications are. And that's just been a thing. I think that's just been, the fundamental way that I've always thought and always approached.
I think, for example, the essay you have toward the beginning about Lincoln, and you take as a jumping off point the Spielberg movie about Lincoln.
Mm-hmm.
And so there's this kind of interesting triangulation in the piece between what the reality of, let's say, the 1860s were in America, with the reality of the Obama presidency, then with the kind of semi-fictive reality of a film, which picks and chooses among the moments of Lincoln's life to portray a heroic figure that signed, the 13th and 14th Amendments. And so it's a very nice reflection where you're kind of using the much messier history of Lincoln's actual life, the way in which it becomes sanitized for a largely white audience in our times, with the complicated position of our first Black president, who is
Yeah.
trying to negotiate politics and race in the 21st century. And something I was sort of struck by in reading through that piece, but others as well, was that I feel like as a Black journalist, you had your ear to the ground much more acutely than most of us in understanding how fragile the Obama moment was. I mean, I think, I wasn't naive enough to think that we had really achieved a post-racial society because we'd elected Obama. But I was maybe a little bit more optimistic that we might be moving beyond certain,
Sure.
dynamics. And I think there's a kind of already a fairly prescient pessimism in some of those early pieces that I was impressed by as I read back through them. And I'm wondering if you felt how you feel about going back through that work of you can sort of almost feel the Trump backlash even in that piece that's written or in some of those early pieces that are written in the 2012, 2013, 2014 period.
So there was this incredible exuberance, that attended, Obama's election, his inauguration, all of the symbolic trappings of the presidency, and part of me really wants to hold on to the feelings that, I had in that moment. I talked to my mother on election night, my mother who had grown up in segregated Alabama at a time when Black people could not vote in that state. And for her, in her lifetime, to experience the violent disenfranchisement of the Black community that she grew up in, and also see an African American elected to the presidency, it was just a stunning comment on, how far we had come. And at the same time, a nagging part of me was drawn to these other kinds of dynamics, these other kinds of questions. And so that was manifested in a conversation that I had with another journalist who's an older journalist, who's a mentor to me. And, this was right after when Obama was in the days leading up to the election, when it was all but sure that he was going to be the next president. And, we talk about it for a while, and then he says kind of gravely, there's going to be hell to pay for this, right? And I said, yeah, I know. And he said, and you also know that the Voting Rights Act is gone. And I said, yeah, I know. And this is prior to the 2012 Shelby versus Holder decision that eviscerated a significant part of the Voting Rights Act.
Yeah.
But, and this was in 2008, we were having this conversation,
Wow.
but it was no one wanted to have that kind of buzzkill.
Mm-hmm.
But also, if we looked at the history, it has tended to play out like this.
Yeah.
These moments of great advancement have sparked, tremendous backlash.
Mm-hmm.
And, it was, if we cared to observe, it would have been obvious that we would have experienced the same thing in that circumstance.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. No, I think the Black community was much more attuned to that possibility or even likelihood.
Mm-hmm.
David?
I was curious about your remarks about Obama, and there are several pieces about Obama in the book, but also about the kind of method that's revealed by the way you've curated the book. So what we have is sometimes sort of boots on the ground, immediate reporting, as in the cases of Ferguson and others. And then there are also these kinds of reflective essays about what has happened. And this goes to Alexander's points about the combination of historian and journalist. And then occasionally you get updates from today. You have postscripts that you write at the end of some of these pieces. And so it's a reflection on the reflection on the immediate events.
Mhm.
And do you take this to be a kind of progress so that the final word is the one you're giving us today, or to get the whole picture, we have to take in all three of those, the immediacy, the reflection, and then the postscript kind of reflection? And I was curious about that with respect to your thoughts about Obama, because many of the things you write are very nuanced and some critical. And I'm wondering if in looking back today, you might say some of the same things that you said at the time.
Yeah, I mean, I think that one of the interesting exercises there was I told a friend of mine to see what my batting average was. Well, I was going back and saying, oh, I totally missed that. I swung and missed. And other times I'll say, oh, okay, I made contact. Maybe I got on base. There. And so that was part of it. And then the other part of it was I thought that the value of the collection might be in doing the same thing. Like some of those pieces looked backward or were trying to use history to understand the present. And I was like, well, what does that look like now? What else has transpired since then? And that's where the kind of my editor encouraged me to actually kind of engage with those pieces, some of which were hard to revisit, because I think the ones that I got wrong were probably easier to reread than the ones that I got right in some instances.
Mm-hmm. One that you did get right, but you worried later was so obvious as not to have needed to be mentioned, was the loss of American exceptionalism with the election, the first Trump election.
Yeah.
It was kind of an interesting admission on your part.
Well, it was an interesting idea. So the idea of American exceptionalism has always been a little strange to me, because I've always thought that being exceptional was like being rich or being good looking, which is that it's much better for other people to say that about you than for you to say it about yourself. Mm-hmm. And so, we shouldn't really invest in referring to ourselves as exceptional. And also we should just maybe let history be the judge of that. But, the bigger thing is that the creed of exceptionalism, more often than not, requires a certain kind of cooking of the books. And so, which we're seeing, we're seeing, book bans, we're seeing, areas of historical inquiry that we don't want to touch upon. We saw the president complain that he thought the Smithsonian was too obsessed with how terrible slavery was. And was like, well, slavery was pretty terrible. This country owes its origins to a relatively mundane dispute over tax policy. Imagine if the British had actually been buying and selling colonists, or disrupting their families, or raping and impregnating colonial women. And then what grounds that would have given for revolt. And so if we want to be exceptional, I've always suspected that the only honest route to exceptionalism is in a phenomenal willingness to confront your own worst moments, not the opposite.
I think in confronting those, what I found most powerful about the book was that living from 2012 until today, it's just a mass of events that have occurred, lots of bad things, some decent things, sometimes good things. But living through it at the time, it just seemed like chaos and tons of things happening in a way that I couldn't put my finger on as any kind of pattern. And what you've done in the book, I think, is to compress time in a way. Mm-hmm. And so that when we read through it, we see the events, and you're highlighting certain specific kinds of violence against Black Americans by white Americans very often. And to have that highlighted and to see that pattern running through these years in a quite distinctive and horrifying way, and also in a way that sometimes you describe as almost inevitable. Mm-hmm. I find that remarkable about the book. And I wonder if you could just say something briefly about what you take the sources, many of them, to be of this, and to speak to the possible inevitability of this pattern.
It's very strange, because I don't know that I would say inevitable, but I would say it is redundant.
Mhm.
These patterns of behavior that we have seen again and again and again in American life, and this is just one strand that I happen to pull. And the first piece in this collection is was originally titled Trayvon Martin and the Parameters of Hope. It was the first piece I ever wrote for the New Yorker, and it was about what was then a kind of news blip out of Florida about this teenager who had been killed, and there had been no arrest despite people being aware of who the person who killed him was. And they were like, "Why don't you take a look at this?" I said, okay, I'll take a look and I'll write something. And after I filed, my editor at that time, who was Amy Davidson, was a great editor and great writer for the New Yorker. She said, "This seems like it might go somewhere. Why don't you just follow this thread and see what happens?" And I feel like I did that for a decade. That I followed that suggestion for a decade. And what happened over the course of that time were that some of these patterns began to show up. Usually, if you cover things long enough, if you cover any beat long enough, you come to recognize the patterns that are implicit within it. And I think that's part of what we see here in the
Yeah,
collection. Mhm.
I was very struck in reading back through the collection, just the reminding me of the kind of tragic litany that happens in those years, from Trayvon Martin to,
Just Ferguson, yeah.
Ferguson, Michael Brown, Ahmaud Arbery, Freddie Gray, Breonna Taylor. One can go on and on. The list is long, and many of those things are covered. And again, I think that your background and knowledge of history helps, that the kind of violence that is present in those things, in some sense, for some people, is very surprising, and for others, not surprising at all. That the fact that we had essentially an undemocratic regime in more than a third of the country that was based on physical terror, and the not only the likelihood but the virtual certainty of violence if certain codes were not respected, I think makes all of that unfortunately all too predictable.
Yeah, it does. But one of the things that I also held at the same time was the idea that progress is possible, which I wonder about. Like, I don't know if I convey that as much, as I know it can be a difficult narrative to pursue. But I also thought, like, the thing that I said about my mother not being able to vote, and then seeing Obama elected, I don't think that that's maudlin or romantic, or silly or any of those things, or trite. I think those things really do matter because in some ways they're a barometer of the idea of what people were pursuing, even sometimes at the cost of their own lives. And
Well,
so
the fact that they were national cases, after all, stuff like this happened all the time.
that's right.
Previous decades, the fact that these became national incidents that people had to pay attention to, which raises another point, because it's another kind of sub-theme of the book, which is this period, which now looking back on it seems like a period of backlash, was also a period of intense political activism on a number of fronts. So you had, although it slightly predates, but you had Me Too, Occupy Wall Street, Black Lives Matter, MoveOn.org, all kind of happening in the same 15-year period. And I'm wondering whether you feel like, looking back on that, whether those things faded out and were not ultimately consequential, or whether we see them having gone underground and resurfacing in moments like, let's say, the Mamdani election.
Yeah, I mean, I think that for Occupy, if we looked at Occupy, then we looked at 2016 with Bernie Sanders. There's clearly DNA, that connects to that populist surge, and even the kind of subsequent circumstances we saw with the election of AOC or people like that. Those things are connected in these ways, and Me Too arose, which is, I could have probably done a parallel collection if we had just gone from 2017 to 2024, looking at the emergence of the Me Too movement and all of the dynamics that went into it, and then the backlash that very much resembled the backlash we saw to things like Black Lives Matter, and very often with the same people, the people who were opposed to this particular kind of progress. And it also meant that people had to say the thing. When I grew up, and I first began observing politics, we were in the heyday of coded language. But now, people can say things that are overtly misogynistic and overtly racist and xenophobic and anti-Semitic, and a whole array of things that were once more veiled. And I think that it's the kind of equal and opposite reaction, because there had been significant progress in pointing to the inequities that the fault lines that people were dealing with. What we got on the opposite version of that was the much more virulent, unapologetic expression of these sentiments that were no longer, or had for so long not been, socially acceptable.
Yeah, well, it reminds me of to virtue. So you pretend, you.
Can you repeat that sentence, Alexander? You froze for a second.
Sorry, hypocrisy is the complement that vice pays a virtue. So in other words, the fact that people used to have to hide racist sentiments was an acknowledgement that it wasn't okay. And now that particular taboo has fallen, as we see Nick Fuentes interviewed by Tucker Carlson and so forth.
Right.
One thing, a piece that I was really struck by in rereading this collection was the piece about the Rachel Dolezal, if I'm pronouncing that correctly.
Yes.
Piece. This is a woman who, became a well-known academic on the issue of race, and even assuming the head of the National Association of the Advancement of Colored People in her state, who then is revealed to have had two white parents and not to have been Black. But you make it's a really fascinating essay, I found, which is a kind of riff, in a way, on the absurdity of race itself. And one line which I particularly admired, and I wanted at some point to actually talk about sentences, because I underlined a lot of sentences in the book that I thought that were particularly well crafted and I think readers would enjoy. But so you say at a certain point, this doesn't mean that Dolezal wasn't lying about who she is. It means that she was lying about a lie. In other words, that race is in a sense a performance, which has nothing to do with skin color, because she was white. And you talk about, for example, the incredible absurdities and ironies of somebody like Walter White, who is like the head of the NAACP, but is so fair-skinned that he passes for white and can document lynching because nobody thinks he's Black. And it sort of becomes this fascinating kind of riff into the, absurdity of race. I wonder if you felt like it. The last paragraph in that piece, which is on page 91, I think really powerful and gets at some of that.
Yeah, and so
Talk about Obama's complicated, his being biracial, and the way in which Black and white Americans considered Obama's race, and I thought all that stuff was super, super fascinating.
yeah, I'll read the Dolezal
Yeah.
paragraph, and then we can kind of jump into the Obama stuff. But Rachel Dolezal is not Black by lineage or lifelong experience. Yet I find her deceptions less troubling than the vexed criteria being used to exclude her. If Blackness is simply a matter of a preponderance of African ancestry, then we should set about the task of excising a great deal of the canon of Black history, up to and including the current president. If it is simply a matter of shared experience, we might excommunicate people like Walter White, whose blue eyes were camouflage that could serve both to spare him the direct indignity of racism and enable him to personally investigate and expose lynchings. Dolezal was dishonest about an undertaking rooted in dishonesty. And no matter how absurd her fictional Blackness may appear, it's worth recalling that the former lie is far more dangerous than the latter. Our means of defining ourselves are complex and contradictory, and could be nothing other than that. But if the rubric is faulty, it remains vital. The great majority of Americans recognize slavery as a figment of history, interred in a receding past. But for Black people, that past remains at the surface, close at hand, indelible, a narrative as legible as skin. That's what it ends.
Yeah. I couldn't find a passage about Obama, which I thought was super interesting. I think you compare him to Coltrane or somebody like I'm now.
Oh yeah. There was an Barack X. Yeah.
Okay. Oh yeah, that. Yeah, and that had some really nice. I loved the first paragraph of that thing about Baraka. Yeah, and there's a thing about his bebopping his way through his racial identity. But I think that the stuff about Obama having sort of, in a way, broken the code by being both Black and biracial, and having almost two different identities for Black and white America is very insightful, and helps to explain how somehow he navigated that complicated, fractured society that we are.
Yeah, it was fascinating to see, because Obama was very aware of what he was doing. He understood, throughout his whole life, he'd understood how he was perceived. And he had understood the categories of race well enough to step inside them and undermine them from the interior, which was indicative of like how he moved through the world, because he had this vernacular Blackness. He walked in a particular way, he talked in a particular way, he had his body language, and he understood a particular kind of cultural mores and traits and how behaviors and everything that very much suggested to African Americans that he was like an insider. But he was also a person who had converted.
Right.
He had not had any connection to African Americans until nearly his adulthood. Well, actually, in his adulthood, when he goes to the South Side of Chicago.
Yeah.
So his precious little relationship to this culture that he eventually becomes the preeminent, reference point for. And at the same time, he is a product of the Midwest. He is a product of Hawaii. He
Right.
is very much the product of his white mother. He understands white people in a way that is different from the way very many African Americans who don't have a white parent would. He
Right.
understands like how race operates. He's been this really adroit student of the subject, and that's why I said in that piece that he was riffing on the idea, like, you know, something from John Coltrane, you
Yeah.
know, because it's not simply it's one thing to say, oh, I can understand how this works, and another thing to say that I can operate as kind of a kaleidoscope. People can look at me and see all kinds of things. And I can use that in a way that ultimately the net result is that African Americans or Blackness finds itself in a place no one else expected it to ever be, i.e. 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue in the West Wing.
So I want to remind people that if they're watching on the live stream right now, that they can post comments, and in about 5 minutes, then we can start asking Jelani to respond, or Alexandra as well. So I want to bring out what seemed to me to be a weirdness, this kind of tension in what you were just saying about Obama and Blackness, and what you were saying in response to Alexandra earlier about the Rachel Dolezal case, which I found to be an absolutely fascinating essay, in part because it raises really huge questions that I take seriously as doing philosophy of race, which I find to be absolutely fascinating, which is whether or not race is real, or whether or not it's purely social construct, or whether it's some kind of weird conglomeration of both. Maybe we should be pluralists about it. Maybe what matters is what matters normatively at a certain point in time, whether or not someone counts as Black. So I was wondering if you'd thought more about these issues, and if you'd provide some remarks if you cared to.
You know, I mean, I think that, you know, it's a question that I've been pursuing or trying to sort. And, you know, in some way, it's like, is Atticus Finch real? You know, as a fictional character. And we can say no. Like, if we go back to the Yellow Pages, you know, in Alabama, we will not find any attorney you know, by that name listed. But at the same time, Atticus Finch is an exemplar of a particular ideal that has resonated with people in ways that are so significant that the impact is real, even if the person never was. And so I think that it's like us having to grapple with race in the same sort of way. It's a complete biological fiction, but it's a fiction that has been imposed, and we've proceeded as if it were real, and the consequences of it, you know, have been real. And so at some point, it's like, is Superman real? Yes and no. It's just like, it depends. You know, there's no Daily Planet and there's no Clark Kent. You know, there's no Lois Lane or these, you know.
Right. Well, in a way, like, the ultimate absurdity is to think that Black people donating blood was not allowed in segregated hospitals. Their blood is red. Their blood is exactly the same as anybody else's blood. And yet, in the fictional world of the one drop rule, it was seen to be contaminated. I mean, that's sort of almost like the ultimate expression of that craziness.
It is. And it goes through all of these kinds of, even, I mean, like the kind of language, it's like, it's fallen out of favor as terminology now. But, you know, the reference to a person who was of Black and white ancestry, you know, had a Black parent and a white parent, you know, the standard reference term, you know, in, you know, mid 20th century and earlier America was mulatto. And you still hear people use that term, you know, ill-advisedly, but people use that term mulatto because they thought it was the same. A Black person and a white person having a child was effectively the same as, you know, mating a mule and a horse to produce mating a donkey and a horse to produce a mule. And so they thought these were the human equivalents of mules. and that's where the term mulatto came from.
Mhm.
But the fact of it is that mules can only be produced in this way, and the result is that they are sterile. But a Black person with Black and white parentage can have children, as we know, obviously. And so that can't be, the biological analogy doesn't hold up, that
Right.
there is no, vast distinction that
Right.
separates a person of European ancestry from a person of African ancestry, but we still engage that idea and that term, for centuries, kind of subscribing to this and placing faith in this idea that didn't have any actual valence.
We have a question from our audience, from Albert Zaleski Benbassa. Thank you all for this fascinating book talk. We recently observed banned book weeks around the country. I assume that's a celebration of not banning books. Who do you all think is benefiting from these outrageous book bans?
I don't think anyone is benefiting from book bans. I think there are people who believe that they're benefiting from book bans. And that is, the attempt to curate what people can know, what they can learn. And, my position on this has always been, what does it say about your argument if you have to prevent people from reading in order to win? In order to win the argument, you have to prevent people from having free access to information that might be contrary, that might offer viewpoints that you don't agree with. And so politically, I think it's advantageous for people who are interested in curating a very particular blinkered viewpoint of what the country is, what the salient issues within the country are, how people live their lives who may be different from what your kind of general experience is, and all of those things. But ultimately, even the people who are pursuing those bans, I think, are undermined by it because it becomes very difficult to engage in a complicated world if you're only willing to traffic in simplicities.
And so this is probably quite relevant. Throughout various parts of the book, there are occasional references to critical race theory. And one essay is on one of its originators, Derek Bell. And I'm wondering if you could say a few words about why you take that to have generated the unbelievably vitriolic response that it has gotten, that the elimination of all sorts of books that are even remotely related to it, and of course its connection to wokeity and wokeness.
Yeah, but I mean, the thing that's so weird about it is that, Patricia Williams, who is, one of the legal scholars associated with the movement that came to be known as critical race theory, she had a really good phrase. She referred to what Christopher Rufo, who was the kind of primary person on the right, who was promoting this panic over critical race theory, she referred to what he did as definitional theft. That he had stolen the original language that described, what critical race theory was, and in its place, he put together this collection of kind of mythologies, and very much of what people on the right referred to in the course of that debate. Very much of what people referred to was not, in fact, critical race theory at all. I heard people who were sometimes on the left who would refer to critical race theory, and I'm like, that's not it either. Critical race theory was a very clearly defined body of legal scholarship that examined questions about the way in which legal structures and therefore societal structures tended to reproduce a certain kind of status quo ante around race. And that was it. No second grader or third grader. If your third grader was being exposed to critical race theory, then I would say congratulations, because your child is in law school.
Right. Yeah, they're quite dense, law review articles that he wrote that, would give you a headache to make your way all the way through.
Right.
We have another question from the audience from L. Andrews. Mr. Delaney Cobb, thank you for your Are you anticipating a book? Thank you.
That's very funny. It's a very funny question because most of the time, you'd be taken aback by that. Like, isn't it enough that I did this one?
That's right.
Why do? But the fact of it is that yes, I actually am. The way that this collection came about was that I was working on another book about, when people would ask, I would say shorthand is that it's about race, democracy, and demagogues. And so not applicable at all to our current situation. but I started thinking about questions I had started to pursue, in my work at the New Yorker. And after a while, I was rereading work, and it occurred to me that I should put together this collection as kind of a table setting for the next book, which I hope to be done with, over the Christmas break. And I've been working on that, off and on for a couple years. But that book is a further exploration of some of the ideas that I started to think about at the New Yorker in these pieces.
Good. Yeah, go ahead, Alexander.
Derek Bell ended up with a pretty pessimistic take on things. And I wonder if you can talk about that and to what extent that impacted you and where you come out on, where he ended up.
So Derek Bell was the legal scholar, who really was at the center of what became critical race theory. And he had begun his career as a civil rights lawyer and, was filing, lawsuits in some really dangerous stretches of Mississippi in the early 1960s. And he believed that they had each of these kind of legal watershed decisions, these monumental cases that they won, had moved the country forward in a particular way. But toward the end of his legal career, he began to question that. He began to question whether there had been any progress at all. And then as a legal scholar, which was his kind of second stage of his career, he wrote these increasingly pessimistic forecasts and these pessimistic analyses of where the country was racially. Now, in all fairness, some of his colleagues and, friends, people who knew him, for years or decades, said that he was also a provocateur. So he would sometimes make arguments and want people to make the counter argument. But I remember when, we were on the verge, he knew Barack Obama when Professor Bell was on faculty at Harvard Law School and Barack Obama was a law student there. And I was in a kind of group email, and Derek Bell was part of it. And this was, 2007, 2008. And I wanted to gauge people's opinions about like how things were going or what the significance of the Obama, campaign at that point meant. And Derek Bell replied with something that was like incredibly bleak. He said that it was just, essentially a distraction, and that, these were dynamics that would ultimately send the country to an untimely end. The dynamics that Obama was kind of stirring up. And I didn't even know what to do with that. Mm-hmm. And then at some point when I began to see the backlash to Obama, I thought, okay, well, I get what he's saying, but, this is still, a lot. And then January 6th happened. And I remember on that day wondering if Derek Bell knew something that I didn't, had seen something that I had not. Mm-hmm. Because, so much of his pessimism seemed to have been validated.
Yeah. I mean, one of the pieces that I think is sort of foundational in his career is this piece where he questions whether Brown v. Board of Education was properly decided.
Yeah.
Is this like a good thing? And that's like total heresy to anybody who believes in racial equality.
It was heresy to the other lawyers. I mean, he was one of the lawyers who was fighting these cases for the NAACP.
Right.
And in some instances, this had personal consequences for him in terms of his personal relationships with people.
Yeah. And yet, even though I think it's a very provocative piece, there is a grain of insight in that, the sort of thesis of the piece. It's been a while since I read it, but basically it's sort of saying, if you push change, essentially, if you push racial change against the will of a white majority, it's not going to stick. Is kind of a very simplified version of it. And essentially, you see the Civil Rights Act being essentially dismantled piece by piece in the decades since then, with the reversal of affirmative action. But then the Shelby case that you referred to before, and then the case that's currently in front of the Supreme Court, which may take the last legs out from under the Civil Rights Act.
Yeah, that's true. And that was very much consistent with what his analysis was.
Yeah.
Provocateur or not, he has, to use the line from earlier, a higher batting average than most people would be comfortable with, or what we would prefer. It would be good had he just been a kind of pessimistic crank who ended his career, denouncing, things that people held sacred. But that's not how the subsequent history has played out.
We're coming near the end of our time, but I just wanted to ask about the final lines of the book, because it too ends on a bit of a note of darkness, with the election of Donald Trump for the second time and the flurry of activities this year, where it seems to have dismantled a head-spinning number of institutions. But what you write there, and I'll quote, "We will be a fundamentally different country by the end of the next administration. Indeed, we already are." And then you quote Kamala Harris as saying during her concession speech last year that many think we're entering a dark time, but I hope that's not the case. And immediately thereafter, you write, quote, "Given what we already know about Donald Trump, it is all but certain that it will be," end quote. I suspect I might know the answer, but maybe not. But do you persist in this dark thought, or is there some light at the end of the tunnel that you can see, a light we would hope is not a train?
Maybe. I think maybe is the best we can do. But I think that we have a pretty fair case that it is a dark time. You have people being pulled out of their houses at gunpoint and pulled out of their cars at gunpoint. And we're purging the country overwhelmingly of immigrants of color while giving a glide path to white South Africans. We've seen a kind of antagonism and weaponization of contempt in our politics that has few parallels. And I think we have to take that very seriously.
Yeah.
And I don't presume that will be what prevails, but I think the possibility of it prevailing should be cause for concern.
Yeah. Yeah. The only, not to end on too dark a note, the events of the last 24 hours remind one that a week in politics is a long time.
Yes, a really long time.
And it's sort of one of the things that one experiences reading your book is this kind of sense of time warp. To think that Barack Obama was president less than 10 years ago, it feels like it happened 100 years ago.
Yes, it does.
Yep. And so our sense of time of, wait a second, this is the same country that elected Barack Obama that is currently undergoing what it's undergoing under Trump. It's sort of hard to actually get those two thoughts into the same sentence.
Yeah, it's true.
And yet this is the country we live in, which is full of those contradictions that could elect those two very different people. But what will happen next year or 3 years from now, anybody's guess. Will we have free and fair elections, or will we see some, blue wave? People were basically saying like the Democrats were dead in the water a week ago, and now suddenly they're not. It's, as we said, politics, a week in politics is a long time.
Yeah.
On that note of uncertainty,
Uncertainty.
possible optimism. I think we have to end here. Thank you so much, both of you, for a terrific conversation, and I so highly recommended Jelani's book. It's quite a read.
Thank you.
Thanks again.
Thanks
There
both.
it is.
Yep, there we are. Bye-bye.
Thank
Bye.
you.